In this video, we are going to build a modern developer portfolio website with Next.js, Tailwind, and Framer Motion. This project was inspired by a real portfolio, which I'll link down below for you to go check out. Here's a quick demo of what we're going to build. So at the top, we have a hero section with a brief intro, some social button links with some nice hover effects, and the rest of the website is just a grid of project preview cards, which have a nice hover animation when I hover over any of these, as well as if I scroll down, a nice reveal fade-in animation as well. So to get started, go ahead and download the starter code using the link in the description down below. Make sure to run npm install to get all the dependencies. And with that, let's get into it. Here we have the starter code for this project. As you can see, it's pretty basic starter code, just a blank one-page website using Next.js and styled with Tailwind, and everything is contained right now just in this index file. The other thing to mention is in the public folder, there are a bunch of assets that we'll be using throughout this project. So with that, let's jump in and start with building the Navbar. So for that, I'm going to create a new folder called components. And there we will make a Navbar file, create a new functional component called Navbar, and let's just bring it into the index file as well. Now, heading back to the Navbar file, let's start building this out. So I'm going to wrap this in nav tags. And inside this nav tag, there's going to be two main sections for the Navbar. The left part of the Navbar will be a logo, which for this project, we'll just make it stylized text. And then on the right side of the Navbar will be the nav links. So we'll contain those two sections in two divs in the Navbar. So first div will have two elements of the stylized logo. First is we'll make a circle out of another div that we'll style in a second. And then the second is we'll just throw a span in here and just put the word portfolio so that shows up. And the second div, which will be where our nav links live, we will simply put a few next links in here. And let's just, for now, set the hrefs to be blank so they don't go anywhere. And we'll have three links, one for home, one for projects, and one for contact. So then you can see those show up here. All right, now let's get to styling some of these. So let's start with the overall nav. First, I'm going to apply a flex box to this, put justify between to space out these two, item center to vertically align, and let me give this a vertical and horizontal padding as well. Okay, so we have laid these two sections out. Now the first div, I'm going to add some styling here. Also make this flex, item center. And I'm going to apply a gap of 1 character. Now let's style this div, which is going to be a yellow circle. So I'm going to set a width and a height of 5 units. Make the background this yellow 400 from Tailwind. Do rounded full. So this will make it a circle. There'll be the yellow circle there. And then finally on the span, let's style this text. I'll make it text small. I'm going to put it semi-bold. And I'm going to widen a little bit the spacing as well, the character spacing. So then you get this nice stylized text here. All right, so that's the left part of the nav bar. Now let's just manage the nav links. So on this surrounding div, do flex, apply a gap, set the text size to medium. And by default, we'll set the text color to this sync 400. So that spaces this out. We're going to assume that the home link is the one that's active. So add some additional styling to this home link, make the texture black, and then make the font weight a little bit heavier. Hit save. So now it's pretty clear home is active and then the other two are inactive. But with that, we have pretty much the nav bar set up. Now the final thing I'm going to do here that will impact the nav bar, but also the rest of the page is I'm going to set a max width on the entire page's content so it doesn't stick all the way to the edges, especially as screen sizes increase. So for that, we're going to apply some global styles in the globals.css file. And so in this file, we're just going to add some CSS to the body. We'll apply the following Tailwind classes. We'll say max width of 90%. The width by default will be 1080 pixels, and horizontal margin of auto, which will horizontally center it. If I hit save, we can say we restrict the width of the entire content, including the navbar, which will make this much more legible and will make this scale much better. Great. So with that, we can move on to the hero section. So we'll add the content for the hero section in this index file. So let me remove this main tag for now, this placeholder, and I'll create a section tag. And let me apply some styling off the bat here to this section. So as you might remember from the demo, this section has two parts to it. There was a part which had kind of a brief sort of bio on the individual, and then the right-hand side had an image. So to lay those two elements out, we're going to use CSS grid. So on this section tag, I'm going to apply a grid. On a mobile device, we want those two parts of the hero section to stack vertically. So on mobile, we want one column layout. But then as we get to larger screen sizes, we want to actually have two different columns. And in this case, I'm going to set this to manually. The first column will be 2/3 of the size, and then the second column will fill out the remaining 1/3. And I'll apply a gap of 4, and I'll also throw a margin bottom of 4 as well on this section. So right now, obviously can't see any of this because there's no content to lay out. So let's add that. As you said, there's kind of two main sections. So we will set up a couple of divs for that. So the first div will be for kind of the bio. So in here, let's throw in an H1, and let me copy some text. Then I'll add a p tag, and I copied some text in for that as well. If I hit save, we can see the contents there. Then the final part of this section are the social links and the contact me button. So we're going to enclose all of that in another div. And in this div, we'll first throw a button in here. That's a simple contact me button. And then we'll add another div in here, which will end up including all of the social links. So for now, we'll leave a comment. We'll get to the social links in a little bit. But that's the kind of first section of the hero. The second section will be the image of the individual. So again, for that, I will leave this here for now, and we'll come back and style this in a second. All right, so now let's go ahead and add some styling to all of these elements. So let's start with the first div. Let's add some styling here. So I'm going to set a height of 30 rem, because by default, the CSS grid doesn't define the height here. So we'll manually set the height. I'm going to round the corners, apply a padding, add flexbox, do flex column to position things vertically, add a gap between the elements. Then I will add a background image by passing in square brackets the URL of our background image, which is gradient-bg.jpg. And then finally, we'll apply bg cover to size the background image. So now if I hit save, there we go. We have the background image load in. Now let's go to the text. So this H1, I'm going to apply some styling here. So I'm going to make it a little bit bigger. So text for Excel. I'm going to make this semi-bold as well. Then this paragraph, I'm going to add a flex 1. So what this will do is this will make this paragraph tag stretch to fill out as much space as it can, which ends up pushing this bottom section with the contact me to the bottom, which is what we're looking for. And then in this div, which contains the contact me button, we're going to add some styling. So you're going to do flex column. On larger devices, we're going to make this flex row. So what we're doing here is, again, two main sections, right? There's a contact me button, and there'll be this series of social links. So what we're saying is on small screens, we want these to stack vertically, but on larger screens, we'll stack these horizontally. So hence the flex configurations. Apply item center, apply a gap, and we'll apply justify self end as well. And then let's now style the button. So this button, I'm going to apply a background, black background, white text, make the font a little bit thicker, apply some padding, round the corners significantly, apply a width of 60, by default 60 units. But on large screens, I'm going to set an auto width, so based on the content. Finally, let's go ahead and manage the last component of the hero, which is the image of the individual. So I'm going to go to this empty div here and apply classes here. So I'm going to set the height to be 30 as well. Set the same corner rounding as the other section. Apply a padding. In this case, we'll apply a different background image, just profile.jpg, but also apply a BG of cover. Now you'll notice that background is kind of off-centered here because it by default positions it in top, using the top left of the image. So let's go ahead and center this with BG center, and now shift it to the middle, and so you can see this individual's face. With that, we've covered most of the hero section. The final element here will be the social links. So let's go ahead and do that now. Now, given there's going to be a lot of repetition here with the social links, I'm going to abstract this into a different component. So I'm going to go up here, add a new file, call it social button tsx, new React component in here. And then let me quickly go ahead and just add some social links here. Now you'll notice these are stacking vertically, which is not what we want. So let's go ahead and style this surrounding div, make this flex, item center, and add a gap of 4 to space these out. And so now these are laid out as we want. And so now we can start working with these social buttons. Now, before we get into that, there's a couple of configuration setups that we need to do to appropriately work with these social buttons. One will be configuring SVG files to play nicely as React components. And the second is setting up some custom colors in Tailwind, so we don't need to keep using custom hex codes for the different colors that we're going to use for the different social links. So first, let's go ahead and set up the SVG support. So for this, we're going to go into the next config file. And by default, there's not a ton of stuff in this next config file. All we need to do is add a section here for a SVG Webpack loader. So I'm just going to go ahead and paste it in now. At a high level, what this is saying is, okay, we're going to configure Webpack in a specific way to use this svgr/webpack loader, which is already included in the package.json file in the starter code. And we're going to use these on, or make this relevant for all SVG files, more or less. And then we're just returning this config. So that's what this configuration is doing. And this allows us to, as we'll see in a second, import SVGs directly like components, which make them much easier to work with. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to add some custom configurations on Tailwind on top of the defaults. So for that, we're going to go into the tailwind.config file. And here we're going to add a section for theme, extend, colors, and we're going to define a couple of custom colors that we want to access in using Tailwind utility classes. So here I've copied them in. As you can see, these are the different colors related to the different social platforms that we're going to link in. So with that, let's go ahead and jump into the building of this social button. So for this, the way I'm going to set this up is I'm going to have us pass in both what we want the background color to be, and then also what SVG icon we want to use for a specific social platform. So for that, let me set up a interface for props. The way I'm going to do it here is I'm just going to pass the SVG in as a child to this component, just to make it a little bit easier to work with. So here I'm just going to say children React node. And I'm also going to ask for a background color, which will make it optional, but should be a string by default. And I can't find React node, so let's import that. And then we'll just make sure that the social button component, we specifically tell it to use these props, and then we will destructure the props in here, and we will apply a default value of black for the BG color. Next, let's deal with the actual JSX that we're returning here. So we're going to return a button. In this button, we're going to have a div, and then pass in the SVG as a child. So now let's style the button. We're going to make this dynamic with the class names. And so I'm going to use curly braces and backticks. And then we're going to apply some styling here. So first, I'm going to apply a height and width of 12, background of white. I'm going to round the corners fully. I'm going to add a transition here because we're going to deal with color with hover effects in a second. So transition colors, duration of 200, ease in and out. And then for positioning the children, we're just going to make this flex, justify center, item center, so that centers the content. And you can see immediately we get essentially 4 white circles for right now. There's a couple of other things that we're going to add in here in a second, but first let's style the second div. Now the second div, I'm going to use this to style the actual SVG itself. And so I'm going to say by default, we want the SVG to have a black stroke fill. So I'm going to say full black. I'm going to, again, add some of the transition elements here. So transition colors, duration of 200, ease in and out. And then finally, let's manage the hover effects. So what I'm going to do is, because I want both the background and the actual SVG color to change on hover, I want them to change when we hover over any part of this button, right? So I'm going to use groups from Tailwind to tie the hover effects of everything in this component. So I'm going to apply a group to the button overall. And then in the div, I'm going to say group hover. So whenever any part of this group is hovered over, I'm going to have a fill of white. So it's going to change the SVG to be white. Now, the last thing that we're going to need to do is we need to change the background of this button to our custom colors that we just added on hover. Now, you might think by default, we can just inject them directly in, but because of the way that Tailwind works and the fact that when the project builds, it will translate all these Tailwind classes to actual CSS, we can't just directly do something like, oh, hover of BG dash, and then just pass in like BG color. Like this will not work. Because on build, it will look at this and be like, I don't know what BG dash BG color is. That's not a thing. And so essentially none of it will work. So to get around that, we have to do a little of extra work outside of the actual JSX. I'm going to make a variable here called, let's just call it BG hover color class. And then I'm going to do a switch on BG color. And then let's say, for example, this we get passed in as dribble. We'll say that the BG hover color class is, and here we will say explicitly hover BG dribble and break it. And then let me do this for the rest of the options. All right, so I've added them in for the other social platforms as well. And now in the JSX, we can now pass in BG hover color class. Now, I know this seems a bit weird, like why do we have to go through all of this? Well, it turns out when this project builds, it is going to see this Tailwind class show up somewhere. And so it will properly translate this into the right CSS during the build. And so when this gets injected in, even dynamically, it will then be the appropriate CSS styling that you need to get the desired result. So that's why just having this explicitly laid out somewhere allows it to work out. So with that, we have the social buttons set up. So now let's go ahead and go back into the index file. And you can already see here it's complaining because it's saying, well, you need this property of child that's missing. So first, let's pass in the BG colors that we want. So first one will be dribble. Next one will be Instagram. Next one will be Twitter. And then finally will be LinkedIn. And now we need to actually bring in the SVGs themselves. Now, how are we going to do that? Well, because of the Webpack configurations we did earlier, we can just import them directly as if they were components. So for example, I could say import dribble from, and then just go ahead and find the SVG here, dribble.svg. And so now, for example, in this first social component, I can now just say dribble as if it was a component. If I hit save, you can see it errors out here. And that's because we played with the configuration of the environment. And so we need to restart the server. So now I restart the server. When I refresh, it will actually work and it brings in the SVG. It's a little bit small. So I'm going to add a class name here of width of 5 and height of 5. And so now it makes it a little bit bigger and it's nice. And you can see as I hover over it, it has that nice fade and color to the dribble color. And you can see as I go over the other ones, it's the right colors. Now we just need to pull in the SVGs. So now let me go ahead and pull in the other SVGs at the top. All right, so I went ahead and imported the other 3 SVGs in, again, in the same fashion. And I've also just brought them in as components and also set this width and height for each of them. And you can see we now have all of the social icons. And if I hover over them, they also have the right colors for each of the platforms. And so with that, we have now completed the hero section of the website. Next, let's get into the project preview cards. So for that, I'm going to first set up, again, another component. Go ahead and call it project preview. create a new functional component. And now in the index file, let's create a new section for this grid. So for now, I'm just going to bring in a project preview. Again, it's not going to be an interesting component. And I'm going to bring in 6 of these. So we have them. And now let's just go ahead and style the laying out of these 6 for now. So in this section tag, I'm going to add some styling. I'm going to also make this a grid layout. On mobile screens, we'll want this to, again, just stack vertically. So do a grid calls 1. On larger screens, I'm going to make this a 2-column layout. So grid calls 2. And in this case, we'll just keep all the widths the same of all the cards. So we can just use a default style class, add a gap, and add a vertical margin as well. So hit save, and we can see we've at least laid out all of the project previews correctly. So now with that, we can jump into actually building out each of the project previews. Now, again, the first thing I'm going to do is set up the interface for the props, because there's going to be a lot of different things we want to bring in to this project preview. So first, I'm going to say we want some kind of name. I'm going to make all of these properties undefined, or give the option for them to be undefined with a default value so we can play with these. We need a description. We want an image URL for bringing in the associated image for the product, a background color that we want to use. And finally, I'm going to apply dark mode to some of these images based on what background color we select. So I'm going to give the option to pass in dark so we can tell it, hey, this is going to be a dark background, and therefore make all of the content like the text a lighter color so we can see it. So now we can attach these props to the components. So make this a functional component which takes these props. We'll destructure the props, and I'm going to set a default value for each of these. And so with that, I've just set default values for each of these. So now let's go ahead and start building out the structure of this project preview. So I'm going to surround all this in a div. Now in this div, there's going to be another div inside of this, which will be for the content, because on this surrounding div is where we will apply the background image. And then inside of this div, there's going to be a couple more divs that we'll see in a second why. So the first div will be where all the text lives. So we'll have an H2, and then this H2, there'll be the name of the project. Then there'll be a P tag, which is where the description of this is. And then in the second sibling div, we're going to throw in a arrow component that will just have a button, which is an arrow, which would mean leading out to something eventually. But for this project, we're just going to leave it as is. So for that, we are going to, again, use an SVG that we have in the assets folder, which I'll bring in. We'll just add this in this div here pretty easily. And I'll just apply some quick styling here so we can see it. All right, so that's all the main content. So now let's get to styling some of this. So in the highest parent div, we're going to add some class names here. And I'm going to actually use curly braces and backticks. You'll see in a second why. I'm going to set the height of 30 rem. I'm going to make this have rounded corners. Set overflow hidden. And then I'm going to utilize this dark property to check whether I will add a class called dark or not to this parent. Now, why is this? Well, we're going to take advantage of Tailwind's dark mode utility classes based on the presence of whether dark is present in this div to quickly and easily be able to style things correctly based on whether we want a dark mode enabled or not for a specific card. And to make sure that works correctly, we're actually going to go back quickly into the Tailwind config file, and you can see that there is a dark mode class which I added in the starter code. So this allows us to check for, or tells Tailwind to check for the presence of this specific dark class. And if that is present in a component, then all of its children will adopt the dark mode styling that we're going to set here in a second. Now, the final thing we need to do here as well is actually set the background color. Now, as we talked about earlier, we can't inject this directly into the class names because of what we talked about earlier with how Tailwind will build these utility classes. So instead, we're going to, in this case, just do a traditional style tag, and then just say background. And in backticks, we'll pass in BG color. And in this case, BG color is going to be a hex code. So that's why we can do this like this. If I hit save, you can see actually this gray passes through. And now we can actually see the blocks a lot more easier. So that is the parent div. Now let's go inside to the content. So in this next level of div, I'm going to do some more styling here. So we're going to say height of full or 100%, width full, apply some padding, horizontal and vertical padding. I'm going to apply some transition properties. So duration of 500 milliseconds. And I'm going to say, and this is because I'm going to say on hover, I want this to scale by 105. So this will have a hover effect on this block where all the content will scale up a little bit. And I'm going to say here as well, transition all. So all values will be transitioned and ease in and out. Hit save. You can see the padding was applied. And if I hover over, you can see there's this nice little hover effect. Next thing I'm going to do is deal with the image. And specifically, we're going to set this as a background image. So first, let's apply some background styling. I'm going to say background of cover, background no repeat, and background center. And now we need to actually set the actual background. So for that, again, because it's dynamic, I'm going to use a style tag to directly inject it. So background image will be URL, and I will pass in the image URL property we have. Hit save, and you can see the actual default image we have here, the project1.png, is now showing up everywhere, and it's nicely centered as well in the background. And now let's style the actual content. And what I'm realizing is we actually are going to need one more div here that surrounds these two sibling divs, because what we want is this text to be on the left and this arrow to be on the right. So we need to appropriately position those divs. So for that, in this div, we're going to say display flex and then justify between. And you can see already that exactly positions things as we want them. Then in this first div with the text, we don't need to apply anything to the div itself, but to the actual text, we'll do to the H2, we'll apply font medium, make the text a little bit larger. And here we will set the dark mode styling. So we're saying if we're in dark mode, make this text white, hit save. It just made it a little bit bigger for now. And on this paragraph, we'll say text small. We'll set the color to be zinc 500, but on dark backgrounds, we want this to be zinc 300. It's a little bit lighter. And then finally, let's style this arrow. So the surrounding div, I'm going to say height of 12, width of 12, background of white. Make it fully rounded, which will make this essentially a circle. Then we'll want to center the arrow in this div. So flex, justify, center, items, center. And then we have this nice arrow. And then finally, because this is meant to be a button, we'll add a cursor pointer as well. So now when we hover over this, we get the hand icon. And we still have the nice scaling effect on all of these preview cards as well. Now let's quickly jump back to the index file, and I'm going to pass in some actual properties to each of these so that it's not just the default blank template. So let me just do that really quickly. So I've just gone ahead and input some custom properties for each of these. And so you can see now things look a little bit more interesting here. So you'll notice, for example, let's take this first one. Because the background image was this kind of darker purple, I also passed in the dark property. And this turned all of our text to white, and so we could see everything. But on other cards, like this one here for admin onboarding, I didn't pass in the dark property, and therefore it didn't apply dark mode and kept all of the text dark. So now there is just one final part of this project, and that is the fade-in animations of these cards as we scroll down and as they come on screen. And so for that, we're going to use framer motion. So let's go back into the project preview component. First thing I'm going to do is make the actual surrounding div a motion div. And make sure we import framer motion. And then inside of this div, we are going to set some properties here. So initial is going to be initial. We're going to use the while in view property, set that to animate. And I'm going to set variance to preview animation, which we haven't set yet. For those of you who haven't used Framer Motion before, variants will be a configuration file, let's think of it as, that will tell it these different statuses of the styling that we want at certain points. So what do we want the state to be initially? What do we want it to animate to? And then all we're saying here is, well, initially, we will use the initial configuration passed in the preview animation. And then when it comes into view, we want to animate to the animate state that will define in preview animation. So that's what these properties are telling Framer Motion. So now let's just go to the bottom here and let's just define this preview animation object. So again, there's going to be two properties here. One called initial, which will be the initial state of the styling, and then another called animate will be the animate state. So for initial, we're going to say, let's set the Y position to be 30. So we're going to make the card start off a little bit pushed down. The opacity will be 0, and the scale will be 0.9. And then the animate, we're going to say, well, we want it to end as Y0, so to the correct positioning vertically. Opacity of 1, so we can see it. A scale of 1. And then we are going to pass also the transition property here. So give it an ease. This is an ease array, which I use quite frequently, so I'm just going to use it here. And duration of 0.8 seconds. Hit save. Can't see anything, but let me refresh the page now. And boom, you can see that it animates in. And you can see as I scroll down, and right as this third row comes into view is when these elements animate in. Again, that's because we're telling explicitly to wait until the element is in the view to go to this animate state. So with that, we've finished building the portfolio website. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them down in the comments below. Also, if there are any other topics you want to see covered on the channel, feel free to drop those in the comments as well. And on screen now, you'll find a link to another great tutorial for you to go check out next, and I'll see you in the next video.